A man's heart stopped on a Tuesday afternoon while the doctor responsible for saving him stood 40 feet away, laughing at something on his phone. The nurse who ran to that bedside wasn't supposed to touch the patient. She wasn't supposed to make the call she made. She wasn't supposed to know what she knew. But she did, because she'd learned medicine in places where the wrong decision didn't end a career. It ended a life. What happened in the next 4 minutes inside Mercy Bluff General Hospital would detonate a scandal so deep it reached the Pentagon. And the woman standing at the center of it, nobody had bothered to learn her name. If you're watching this story, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next part. Hit like if you want justice served, and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has traveled in this world. Now, let's begin. The badge said Lauren Mercer, RN, provisional. That last word was printed in smaller font, as if the hospital wanted to make sure no one mistook her for someone who actually belonged there. Lauren had been at Mercy Bluff General for 11 weeks, long enough to know which supply closet had a broken lock, which attending physician took his coffee with 3 sugars and a side of contempt, and which charge nurse would throw you under a bus before her morning rounds were finished. Short enough that nobody had figured out yet what she actually was, or what she'd done before she walked into this building in Danton, Wyoming, carrying a single reference letter and a nursing license that had required 3 separate waivers to process. She kept her head down. She answered questions with fewer words than the question deserved. She arrived early, left late, and ate lunch alone in the stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floors because the break room was a political minefield she had neither the energy nor the interest to navigate. The other nurses called her the Ghost, not unkindly at first. Then, as weeks passed and Lauren refused to soften into someone easier to categorize, the nickname curdled into something with sharper edges. Ghost showed up early again, she overheard Danny Keyes say one morning, leaning against the nurse's station with a cup of coffee. Danny was 3 years in, confident in the specific way that came from never being seriously wrong about anything yet, trying to impress someone who's never going to notice her. The someone in question was Dr. Philip Garrett, chief of internal medicine, 3rd-generation physician, and the kind of man who accepted compliments the way a plant accepts sunlight, naturally and constantly. He ran his department like a personal kingdom and had cultivated, over 15 years at Mercy Bluff, an airtight reputation that insulated him from nearly any criticism. Staff who pushed back found their schedules quietly rearranged. Residents who questioned his calls found their evaluations less glowing than expected. The system worked exactly the way Garrett needed it to work, which was to say it worked for him and was merely functional for everyone else. Lauren had known men like Garrett before. Different uniforms, same architecture of power. She hadn't impressed him. She hadn't tried. What she had done in 11 weeks was become quietly essential to the floor in ways that nobody officially acknowledged. She caught a potassium dosing error on day 4 that the pharmacy missed. She noticed a patient's skin color change 40 minutes before his oxygen saturation dropped and had the crash cart positioned before anyone called the alert. Small things. Invisible things. The kind of things that kept people alive without anyone ever connecting the outcome to the action. She didn't expect credit. Credit wasn't why she was here. The patient in room 14 had been admitted 2 days before Lauren's shift on the Tuesday. Everything changed. He'd been brought in by ambulance, found collapsed beside a livestock fence on a property outside of town. No wallet, no phone. Clothes that had seen significant weather. The paramedics listed him as a John Doe, approximately late 60s, with a head laceration and an irregular heartbeat that had stabilized by the time they reached the hospital. He looked like a rancher. He had calloused hands and a farmer's tan line and the kind of quiet, weathered face that didn't invite a lot of questions. The floor staff had taken to calling him the old cowboy, not cruelly, but with the easy shorthand that came from an overcrowded unit and not enough time. His chart was sparse. He was conscious enough to refuse to answer questions about his identity, which the charge nurse, Paulette Ramos, noted with mild exasperation. Probably embarrassed, Paulette said. A lot of these ranch guys are. Don't want anyone knowing their business. What the chart also contained, clipped inside a clear sleeve on the back cover the way someone methodical and careful would do it, someone who understood that in a medical emergency the paperwork could matter more than anything else, was a folded laminated card. Military issue. Faded, but legible. Lauren had noticed it during morning rounds when she checked his medication log. She almost didn't pull it out. The patient was stable. The card was old. She'd been told, politely but firmly, by Dr. Garrett's PA that she was to stick to observation and documentation on this patient because Dr. Garrett had personally taken him on as a case. An unusual gesture, but not an impossible one. Sometimes the physicians here picked up unassigned patients when the census got complicated. She pulled the card anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. It was a military medical alert. Standardized format. 2 drug allergies listed. 1 common antibiotic that caused a rash, and 1 antiarrhythmic medication that, in the specific combination with his documented cardiac history, would trigger a potentially fatal response. The card was signed by a military physician whose facility code Lauren didn't immediately recognize, but whose formatting she knew. She'd seen those cards before. She'd filled out that same form for soldiers who needed it before deployment. Lauren clipped the card back, noted it in the patient's chart under allergies with a timestamp, and went about her shift. That notation would matter more than she knew. The cardiac event started at 2:17 p.m. Lauren was at the end of the hall checking a drip rate when the monitor alarm triggered, not the soft, persistent beep of a minor irregularity, but the hard, flat tone that meant something functional had stopped working. She moved before she consciously decided to move, which was a reflex that 11 weeks of civilian nursing hadn't managed to retrain out of her. Room 14. The old cowboy. His heart was in ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic, useless electrical storm that produced no actual pumping. The monitor was screaming. He had maybe 4 minutes of viable brain tissue left if no one intervened. She hit the call button, twice, hard. Code blue, room 14, I need a physician and a crash cart now. She started compressions. His sternum was solid, broad. A man who'd been physically strong for most of his life. She found the correct position by muscle memory and pressed. The crash cart arrived before anyone else did. An orderly named Marcus got there first, wide-eyed, and Lauren directed him to pull the defibrillator without breaking rhythm. "Where's Dr. Garrett?" she asked, not stopping. He's in with the Holbrook family, VIP patient, 3rd floor. They've got him tied up. Someone call him, right now. Tell him room 14 is coding." Marcus disappeared. Lauren kept working. 60 seconds in, no physician. 90 seconds. She knew what the patient needed. The defibrillator was there. The protocol was clear for situations where no physician was present, and she was certified for emergency cardiac intervention, though her provisional status at this hospital created a bureaucratic gray area that the hospital's legal team would later spend considerable energy examining. She'd operated in grayer areas than this. She delivered the first shock. His body arched. The rhythm on the monitor scrambled, and then, in the particular way that still got to her every time she saw it, resolved into something organized. Not perfect, but beating. She was adjusting the oxygen flow when Dr. Garrett walked in. He took in the room, the crash cart, the defibrillator, Lauren with her hand still on the patient, with the expression of a man who had walked into a situation that offended him structurally. What happened here? Ventricular fibrillation. He coded. I intervened. You defibrillated this patient. Yes. Garrett looked at the monitor. The patient's rhythm was stabilizing. He looked at Lauren. Something moved behind his eyes. A fast, quiet calculation. And then his face settled into the expression she would come to know well over the next 24 hours. You're the provisional nurse. Yes. You performed an unsanctioned cardiac intervention on my patient. Lauren met his eyes. He was dying. That is not your determination to make. Garrett stepped closer to the bed, checking the monitors with the practiced efficiency of someone who needed to quickly establish that he was in charge of a situation he'd just arrived at. You should have waited for a physician. There was no physician. I called twice. You should have kept calling. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the patient, whose chest was rising and falling in the specific stubborn way of someone still alive. I did what the situation required, she said. Garrett didn't answer. He picked up the chart, flipped through it, and then his eyes stopped on something. He turned to the back of the folder and pulled out the laminated allergy card. What is this doing in the front of the chart? I flagged it this morning. Drug allergy with cardiac interaction. I added it to the medication log. Garrett stared at the card. His jaw moved slightly. He He set it down without comment and turned to the nurse who had arrived behind him, Danny Keyes, slightly breathless. Get pharmacy on the line, adjust the antiarrhythmic order, and cross-reference whatever she put in the log. He said the way people say that when they're pointing at something they don't want to touch. And get me someone from administration. He left without looking at Lauren again. She should have gone home after her shift. She didn't, because the patient in room 14 still had an unstable secondary rhythm that nobody seemed to be urgently addressing, and she wasn't built to walk away from an unresolved problem. She was writing up her incident report in the documentation room, meticulous, time-stamped, complete, when Paulette Ramos appeared in the doorway. Lauren. Paulette's voice had the careful flatness of someone delivering bad news they'd been instructed to deliver. Dr. Garrett has flagged your conduct for review. Administration wants to see you tomorrow morning. Lauren didn't look up from the keyboard. What time? 8 o'clock. Conference room B. A pause. I'm sorry, I think... Paulette stopped, started again. I think you should bring your union card if you have one. Lauren didn't have a union card. She had something more useful, documentation. She finished the report, printed 3 copies, kept one in her bag, emailed one to a personal address, and left the third in her physical file. Then she went home, made coffee she didn't taste, and sat in her kitchen in the dark for a while thinking about a mountain road in Kandahar, where she'd made a faster decision with worse odds, and a man had walked back to his family because of it. She thought about whether that had been worth it. She thought about the monitor in room 14 resolving from chaos into rhythm. She went to bed at 11 and was awake again by 3. Conference Room B at Mercy Bluff General was a room designed for no comfortable emotional outcome. Fluorescent lights, laminate table, chairs that tilted slightly in wrong directions. Lauren sat across from 3 people: Harrison Webb, the hospital's director of medical operations, Sandra Price, the HR lead, and Dr. Philip Garrett, who had the specific stillness of a man who had written the story before the meeting began. Thank you for coming in, Webb said. He was 45, soft around the middle, with the look of someone who'd managed conflict long enough to have completely detached from its content. I was required to, Lauren said. Webb cleared his throat. We want to be fair to you. This is a fact-finding conversation. Garrett didn't move. His folder was open. His hands were folded on top of it. Ms. Mercer, Sandra Price said, can you walk us through your actions during yesterday's incident in room 14? Lauren walked them through it, sequentially, accurately. She referenced her timestamps. She mentioned the allergy card. She described the rhythm strip and the timeline for physician response. When she finished, Garrett spoke for the first time. The patient's condition deteriorated following the intervention, he said. He developed a secondary complication overnight. Patients in VFib arrests frequently develop secondary complications. His underlying cardiac function was already compromised. The complication is consistent with inappropriate defibrillator use. Lauren looked at him directly. The defibrillator rhythm strip will show the indication was appropriate. Our cardiology department has reviewed it. Garrett's voice was smooth. There's a question about the timing and the charge level. There wasn't. She knew there wasn't. But she understood now the shape of what was happening. Not a conversation, but a structure, built before she arrived, and she was being asked to stand inside it while they sealed the exits. I have a complete contemporaneous report, she said, filed last night at 7:43 p.m. Something flickered across Webb's face. He glanced at Sandra Price. We've reviewed your report, Price said carefully. Did you review the medication log I updated at 0900 yesterday, documenting the allergy flag? A beat. That's part of the review, Webb said. Garrett shifted in his chair, the first real movement she'd seen from him. It was small. It was enough. Lauren set her hands flat on the table. I'd like to understand what outcome this review is intended to reach. Webb leaned forward. Ms. Mercer, your provisional status means the hospital has significant discretion. I understand my employment status. And given the patient harm concerns and Dr. Garrett's assessment, we feel it's necessary to suspend your privileges pending a full clinical review, which will include a report to the State Nursing Board. A State Nursing Board report. That wasn't a slap. That was a crowbar. It could follow her for years. It could, if the report was written the way Garrett would write it, end her ability to practice. On what clinical basis? She asked. Unauthorized intervention, potential patient harm, deviation from protocol. Lauren looked at Garrett. He looked back at her with the patience of a man who had done this before and would do it again. That patient coded, she said. He was in VFib. I was the only medical professional in that room for nearly 2 minutes. If I had waited, protocol requires physician authorization. Protocol also has provisions for life-threatening emergencies without physician availability. Dr. Garrett was available. Dr. Garrett was on another floor. The word available sat between them and rotted. Webb clicked his pen. Ms. Mercer, we're suspending your clinical privileges effective immediately. HR will contact you about the formal process. You'll need to surrender your badge at the front desk. Lauren sat still for a moment. She thought about arguing, not because she expected it to change anything. The decision had been made before she sat down, but because she wanted the record to reflect that she had not been quiet. I want it noted, she said, that my report, the medication log, and the monitor strip from room 14 are part of the record. Noted, Sandra Price said, writing nothing. Lauren stood. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have anything to say that these 3 people deserved. Danny Keyes was at the nurse's station when Lauren came to drop off her badge. Danny watched her without expression. So did 2 other nurses whose names Lauren had never learned. The orderly Marcus was there too, and he looked away when she caught his eye. Not with contempt, but with the particular avoidance of someone who felt something uncomfortable and didn't know what to do with it. Paulette met her at the elevator. She didn't say anything. She touched Lauren's arm, briefly, and then stepped back. Lauren walked out through the hospital's main entrance at 9:14 a.m. The morning was cold, clear, with that particular Wyoming brightness that felt like judgment. She sat in her car for a few minutes without turning the key. She was 41 years old. She had completed 2 combat deployments. She had treated gunshot wounds, blast injuries, crushed traumas, and arterial bleeds in conditions that the physicians upstairs couldn't have functioned in for 20 minutes. She had been decorated twice and mentioned in 3 commendations she never talked about. She had left the Army 18 months ago for reasons that were complicated and private and still sometimes woke her up at 3 in the morning. She had come to Danton, Wyoming because it was quiet, and because nobody there knew anything about her, and because she had wanted, more than almost anything, to simply do the work without the weight of everything the work had once cost her. She started the car. The patient in room 14 was alive. That was a fixed point. Whatever happened to her license, whatever happened to the report, whatever shape the story took in Dr. Garrett's telling, the man had a heartbeat because she had put it back. She drove home. She didn't turn the radio on. She was still in her scrubs 2 hours later when the knock came at her front door. Sharp, twice. The kind of knock that doesn't wait to see if you heard it. She opened the door. The man on her porch was not a neighbor. He was wearing a dark suit that cost more than her monthly rent. And behind him, parked at the curb in a configuration that made no sense for a residential street in a Wyoming town with 1 stoplight, were 2 black SUVs with government plates. A second man stood at the bottom of her porch steps. He was in uniform, not hospital scrubs, not a police uniform, military, full-service dress, the kind worn for official functions. Lauren's eyes went to his rank insignia out of reflex. Colonel. Lauren Mercer? The man in the suit said. Yes. He reached into his jacket and produced a credentials case. She read it without touching it. Ms. Mercer, I'm Special Agent Daniel Voss, Department of Defense Inspector General's office. He looked at her without urgency, which was its own kind of pressure. We need to speak with you about the patient you treated yesterday afternoon at Mercy Bluff General Hospital. She hadn't spoken for a moment. Not from fear, from the particular recalibration that happened when the shape of a situation changed faster than your expectations could keep up. The unidentified patient, she said. The rancher. Voss didn't change expression, but something in the air around him changed. A density, a weight. That man, he said, is not a rancher. Behind him, the colonel had not moved. The SUVs idled at the curb. Down the street, a neighbor's dog barked once and went silent. Lauren looked at Voss. She looked at the colonel. She looked at the government plates on the vehicles behind them and did the kind of math that doesn't require a calculator, just pattern recognition and enough experience with institutions to understand when something is bigger than you thought it was. "Come in," she said. She stepped back from the door, and somewhere across town, inside the ICU of Mercy Bluff General Hospital, the monitors in room 14 continued their steady cadence, the sound of a life that had almost ended, held in place by a decision nobody in that building was yet ready to admit had been the right one. They didn't sit down right away. Agent Voss moved through her living room with the controlled economy of someone who assessed spaces professionally, not intrusively, but thoroughly, the way a person does when they've spent years walking into situations that looked one way and were another. The colonel, he introduced himself as Colonel Ray Thurston, Medical Command Liaison, stood near the window with his cover tucked under his arm and said nothing. Outside, one of the SUVs had pulled forward slightly, repositioning without any visible instruction. Lauren noticed that too. She went to the kitchen and came back with water because it was something to do with her hands. She set 3 glasses on the coffee table and sat in the chair across from the couch. She didn't offer coffee. She wasn't trying to make anyone comfortable. "Tell me who he is," she said. Voss sat. Thurston stayed standing. They'd clearly decided their positions before they knocked. "The man in room 14, Voss said, is retired General Marcus Aldridge, 4-star, former Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Joint Chiefs, retired 8 years ago." He paused. "His son is currently the Commanding General of U.S. Army Forces Command." Lauren absorbed this the way she absorbed most significant information, without visible reaction, while her mind ran through implications at a pace her face didn't reflect. "He was found alone," she said, "on a fence line. He has a property outside Danton, uses it as a private retreat, goes by his middle name out there. Some of the locals know him as Walt. He prefers it." Voss's tone was neutral, but carried the specific patience of someone explaining context they found somewhat frustrating. His security detail was rotating. There was a gap. It shouldn't have been as long a gap as it was, and that's a separate matter being addressed separately. He refused to give his name when he was admitted. He's done that before, apparently. Doesn't want special treatment when he's on the property. Doesn't want people making calls on his behalf. Voss picked up the water glass, looked at it, set it back down without drinking, which worked fine until his heart stopped. Lauren looked at Thurston. He was watching her with the careful attention of a physician watching a patient walk, measuring her, but not unkindly. "Your intervention," Thurston said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was even, deliberate. "Walk me through it." "I filed a complete incident report." "I've read it. I want to hear you say it." She walked him through it. She was accurate and concise. She named the rhythm, the timeline, the charge level, the subsequent stabilization. When she got to the allergy card, Thurston's eyes sharpened slightly. "You flagged it at 0900, he said. "Yes." "Before the event?" "Yes." "And the medication order that was in place when you came on shift had not been cross-referenced against the allergy card. The card was in the back of the physical chart. It wasn't in the system." She kept her voice level. "I added it to the electronic record at 0917 with a note flagging the interaction risk." Thurston and Voss exchanged a look. Not dramatic, quick, and contained. But Lauren had spent years reading the communication that happened between people who worked together closely enough to have stopped needing full sentences, and what passed between these two men in that half-second was significant. "Ms. Mercer," Thurston said, "if you had not flagged that allergy, and if General Aldridge's cardiac event had been treated with the antiarrhythmic already on order, he would have died," she said. "The interaction with his underlying rhythm pathology at that dosage level? Yes. He would have died." The room was quiet for a moment. "And if you had waited for physician authorization before defibrillating," Voss said. She didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know, because she was measuring how honest she wanted to be with people she'd known for 11 minutes. "He might have survived," she said, "or he might not have. 4 minutes is the window. By the time I'd have gotten Garrett on the phone and talked him through authorizing from another floor," she stopped. "I didn't think waiting was the right call." "Where did you serve?" Thurston asked. She looked at him. "That's in my file." "I'd like to hear it." 2 deployments, 10-year service, combat medic, later senior trauma specialist, forward operating unit. She kept her hands in her lap. I transitioned out 18 months ago. Why? That's personal. Thurston nodded once, accepting the boundary without comment. Another thing that told her something about him. Voss leaned forward slightly. Miss Mercer, here is where we are. General Aldridge is alive and currently stable at Mercy Bluff General. His family has been notified and is en route. The Department of Defense has opened a security review related to the gap in his protection detail. He paused. Separately, the Inspector General's office has been asked to review the circumstances of his admission and treatment, including all clinical decisions made during his stay. Including mine, including yours, and including Dr. Garrett's. She felt something shift in the room, not dramatically, not like a door slamming, but like a pressure change before weather. What do you need from me? She asked. Right now, everything you have, the report you filed, any personal notes, anything you observed or documented. Voss reached into his jacket and produced a card. And your availability for the next several days. We may need you on site. Lauren looked at the card. She looked at Voss. I was suspended this morning, she said. They're reporting me to the nursing board. Neither man looked surprised. That told her they already knew. Which told her they'd been to the hospital before they came here. Which meant the sequence of events this morning had been observed, and the observation had prompted this visit. And the people sitting in her living room were not confused about what had happened or why. Yes, Voss said. We're aware. Are you going to do something about it? We're going to do our jobs, he said, and we'd like you to cooperate with that. She picked up the card. Federal contact information, a direct number. She thought about the conference room. Harrison Webb and his clicking pen. Sandra Price writing nothing down. Garrett's folded hands and the story he'd already finished writing. I'll get you what I have, she said. They were at her kitchen table for 90 minutes. She gave them the printed copies of her report. She gave them the timestamps from her personal email, which established when she'd sent herself the documentation the previous evening. She answered Thurston's clinical questions with the same precision she'd used in post-incident debriefs. And that's what this felt like, she realized. A debrief. The kind she'd done after complex medical situations in theater, where the sequence of decisions mattered because someone was going to learn from them. When they left, she stood in her doorway and watched the SUVs pull away. The neighbor's dog had given up on barking. The street was very quiet. She went back inside and sat down at the table and looked at the place where Voss's glass had left a small water ring on the wood. She didn't know what came next. That was an unfamiliar position for her. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life in environments where the next step was always defined by training or command or the immediate physical demands of the situation. The year and a half since her discharge had been its own education in navigating the particular chaos of a life without that structure, and she was not finished learning it. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a while. She had 3 people she could call: a former colleague in Fort Carson, a cousin in Billings she spoke to twice a year, and a therapist in Laramie she'd been seeing every 2 weeks for 9 months. She didn't call any of them. She wasn't ready to put words to any of this yet. She made a second cup of coffee and drank half of it standing at the kitchen window, watching a pair of magpies argue over something in the yard. Then she went into her bedroom and lay down on top of the covers in her scrubs and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Marcus Aldridge, his broad, weathered hands, his solid chest under her palms when she was doing compressions, the moment the monitor resolved. She thought about the allergy card in its clear sleeve, and whoever had put it there, Aldridge himself probably. The action of a man who was methodical about survival, who understood that the gap between living and dying was often administrative. She thought about the attending physician she'd had in Kandahar during her second deployment, a Navy surgeon named Ott, deeply imperfect, occasionally wrong, and one of the best emergency clinicians she had ever seen work under pressure. Ott had told her once, after a particularly difficult case, that the most dangerous thing in medicine wasn't uncertainty. It was certainty that belonged to the wrong person. She fell asleep thinking about that. The call came at 6:40 the next morning. Not Voss, not Thurston. The voice on the phone was a woman's, clipped, professional, with the tone of someone who scheduled things and expected them to happen on schedule. Ms. Mercer, this is Major Patricia Holm, Medical Command. Colonel Thurston requests your presence at Mercy Bluff General Hospital at 0800. There will be transportation. I can drive myself. A brief pause. Transportation has been arranged, Ms. Mercer. She understood. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a statement about how this was going to be managed. I'll be ready at 7:40, she said. She was showered, dressed, and standing on her porch at 7:38 when the SUV pulled up. They brought her in through a side entrance she hadn't used before, a service corridor that connected to the hospital's administrative wing rather than the clinical floors. She noticed the difference. So did the two hospital staff members she passed in the hallway, both of whom stopped what they were doing and watched her walk by with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Thurston was waiting in a conference room that was not Conference Room B. This one was larger, had a real wooden table, and currently contained 8 people, including Thurston. 2 in military uniform, 2 in dark suits she recognized as federal agents, 1 woman in a gray blazer who turned out to be from the Wyoming State Medical Board, and 3 hospital administrators, including Harrison Webb, who looked like he hadn't slept. Dr. Garrett was not in the room. Lauren sat where Thurston indicated. Nobody offered her water this time, which was either an oversight or information. Thurston placed a manila folder on the table. He didn't open it yet. Before we begin formally, he said, I want to make sure everyone in this room has the same baseline understanding of the situation. He looked around the table with the particular authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to have a room's full attention. The patient admitted to this hospital under a John Doe designation and housed in room 14 is General Marcus Aldridge, retired, 4-star. His presence at this facility, the circumstances of his admission, and every clinical decision made during his stay are now subject to a Department of Defense Inspector General review in conjunction with the State Medical Board. He nodded at the woman in gray. This review is not optional. It is not subject to hospital administrative discretion, and it supersedes any internal disciplinary proceedings that may have been initiated. Webb shifted in his chair. That review, Thurston continued, will include the complete clinical record from admission through current status, all physician orders, all nursing documentation, all medication logs, all monitor data, and all personnel actions taken in relation to this patient's care. He opened the folder. It will also include the personnel action taken yesterday against Ms. Lauren Mercer. The room was quiet, in the way rooms get when nobody wants to be the first one to breathe wrong. Webb cleared his throat. Colonel, the action taken against Ms. Mercer was a standard provisional review process. Walk me through the timeline, Thurston said. He was looking at Webb the way a teacher looks at a student who's just said something incorrect and is waiting for them to realize it. She performed an unauthorized. The defibrillation occurred at 14:17. Physician response time to the room? Webb looked at the woman beside him. Sandra Price. Price had a folder of her own and opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. Dr. Garrett responded, I have the access logs, Thurston said. Room 14's door sensor shows physician entry at 14:23. The code alert was initiated at 14:17. 6 minutes. He looked at Webb. In a ventricular fibrillation event. Dr. Garrett was with another patient. He was with another patient, Thurston agreed. And the nurse in room 14 made a decision. I want to understand the basis on which that decision was characterized as unauthorized misconduct warranting board reporting. Protocol requires... Protocol, said the woman in gray, speaking for the first time. Her name, Lauren would later learn, was Dr. Sandra Mull, and she'd been with the state board for 11 years. Protocol in emergency situations without physician availability is not as absolute as Dr. Garrett's incident report suggests. She set a document on the table. Wyoming Nursing Statute 33-21-119, subsection 4, allows for expanded emergency intervention by licensed nurses when physician response is unavailable and delay creates imminent patient harm. The threshold question is whether Ms. Mercer's assessment of imminent harm was clinically reasonable. She looked at Lauren. Based on the monitor data, was it? Yes, Lauren said. Based on the timestamp of physician arrival, was delay a factor? 6 minutes is outside the viable intervention window for the rhythm I observed, Lauren said. If I'd waited for authorization, the outcome would likely have been different. Mull made a note. Webb had stopped trying to find a comfortable position in his chair. There is also, Thurston said, the matter of the allergy flag. He put a printed page on the table. Lauren recognized it. Her own medication log entry from the morning before the event. Time-stamped. Her name. The allergy card details. The interaction risk. The specific medication that had been on order. This notation was made, Thurston said, at 09:17 yesterday morning, approximately 5 hours before the cardiac event. He looked at the hospital administrators. I'd like to know whether the medication order was adjusted following this notation. Price was looking at her folder again. The folder, Lauren noted, was not helping her. The order was reviewed, Price said carefully. Was it adjusted? A pause that lasted about 3 seconds longer than it should have. Not prior to the event, Price said. The federal agent to Thurston's left, a woman Lauren hadn't heard speak yet, wrote something on a notepad. The medication that was on order, Thurston said, is documented in General Aldridge's military medical record as contraindicated. That documentation is in the laminated card that Miss Mercer flagged and entered into the electronic system yesterday morning. If that medication had been administered during the event, as it may have been, had there been a different clinical outcome, or had a different staff member been present, the interaction risk would have been severe. He paused. I want to understand how a flagged contraindicated medication remained on active order for 5 hours without adjustment. Nobody at the administrative end of the table answered. Lauren sat very still. She was looking at the table because looking at Garrett's empty chair was too pointed, and looking at Webb was too satisfying, and she didn't want either of those things visible on her face right now. The review continued for another 2 hours. Lauren was asked to formally recount her clinical observations, her decision process, and her documentation timeline. She did so with the same clarity she'd used in a dozen official after-action reports. She answered Thurston's questions. She answered Mull's questions. She answered 2 questions from the federal agent, a woman named Reyes who spoke rarely and wrote constantly. At one point, Harrison Webb attempted to reframe the defibrillation as a well-intentioned but procedurally problematic intervention, and Thurston looked at him with such undisguised patience that Webb stopped talking mid-sentence. At no point during the 2 hours did Dr. Garrett appear. When the formal session ended, Thurston asked Lauren to wait in the hallway while the committee conferred. She waited. She stood against the wall in the corridor, which had the impersonal, slightly too bright quality of hospital hallways everywhere, and she listened to the particular silence of a building that was recalibrating around something it hadn't expected. Paulette Ramos walked past and stopped. "You're still here," Paulette said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." Paulette looked at the closed conference room door. She looked at Lauren. Something complicated moved across her face. Guilt, maybe, or its practical neighbor, the thing that looked like guilt but was mostly self-assessment. "Is it bad?" Paulette said. "For the hospital." Lauren considered the room on the other side of that door. The federal agents, the board representative, the folder with the medication log timestamp that nobody had been able to explain. "I think it's bad for some people," Lauren said. "Not the hospital." Paulette nodded slowly. She seemed to want to say something else. She didn't. She walked away, and Lauren watched her go, and then the conference room door opened and Thurston appeared. "Come back in," he said. Eat. Dr. Philip Garrett was escorted into the hospital at 11:15 a.m. by 2 men who were not quite security but moved like it. Lauren saw him from the nurses' station where Thurston had asked her to wait while the administrative component of the review moved to another space. She wasn't supposed to be watching. She watched anyway. Garrett was in his civilian clothes, weekend clothes, which meant they'd pulled him from somewhere he wasn't expecting to be pulled from. He was composed. That was the thing about Garrett. He was almost always composed. It was the version of confidence that looked identical to competence until something went wrong, at which point the distance between the two became visible. He saw Lauren at the nurses' station. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds and then looked away, which told her that he'd already been briefed enough to know the shape of what was happening and had decided that not acknowledging her was a strategic choice. She looked away too, but for different reasons. The next 3 hours happened in pieces she was only partially present for. She was asked to provide an additional written statement. She was interviewed separately by Agent Reyes for 40 minutes in a room with a digital recorder running. She was told by Dr. Mull from the state board that the nursing board complaint filed against her had been flagged for suspension pending the outcome of the DoD review. Suspended, not withdrawn. Not yet. But the difference between suspended and active was meaningful. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Thurston found her in the staff lounge, a different one from the break room, quieter, with a window that looked onto the parking structure, and sat across from her at a small table. "How are you doing?" he said. She was surprised by the question, not by its content, but by the sincerity of it. "I'm managing," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was 60, maybe 62, with the particular economy of movement that came from a long career in environments where energy was a resource. His uniform was impeccable. His face was tired. "I don't know how I'm doing," she said. "I'm going to figure that out later." He nodded. "Fair. Can you tell me what's happening with Garrett?" Thurston was quiet for a moment. Not because he was deciding whether to answer, she thought he'd already decided, but because he was choosing how. "The medication order issue has been formally documented," he said. "Your allergy flag was in the system at 0917. The medication was not adjusted. During the event, the crash cart was in the room and the medication in question was available. Whether it would have been administered absent your intervention is a clinical hypothetical, but the failure to act on a flagged contraindication is not a hypothetical. And the incident report he filed, the one that characterized my intervention as harm, that's being reviewed against the objective monitor data." A pause. "The characterization and the data don't align." She absorbed that. "There's also the VIP patient," Thurston said. "The reason Garrett wasn't on the floor." She waited. "The Holbrook family. Jerome Holbrook. He's a hospital board member." Thurston's voice was level. "Dr. Garrett has a long-standing relationship with that family. He was in that room for 40 minutes during the period when his alerts were coming through on a general floor. The shape of it, fully assembled, was both worse and more ordinary than she'd imagined. Not a complex conspiracy. Just a doctor with a hierarchy of priorities and enough institutional protection that the hierarchy had never been tested before." "What happens to him?" she asked. "That's not my determination." Thurston stood. "But I'll tell you this. When the federal review concludes, the record will be complete. Every decision, every timestamp, every order." He looked at her directly. "Including yours." He left. Lauren sat in the staff lounge for a while longer. The window looked onto the parking structure. Cars came in and left at random intervals, following the logic of their own business. A woman in a red coat walked toward the hospital entrance, moving quickly. 2 men in suits stood near a black vehicle and talked without looking at each other. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Ms. Mercer." It was a voice she didn't recognize. Older, slightly rough-edged, with the flat effect of someone who spent most of their time being listened to rather than listening. "My name is James Aldridge. I'm Marcus's son." She sat up straight. "I understand you're the person who kept my father alive," he said. She didn't confirm or deflect. She just waited. "I'd like to speak with you in person," he said. "This afternoon, if possible. My father is conscious. He's asking about you." Through the lounge's small window, one of the men in suits near the black vehicle looked up at the building, not at her window specifically, but in that direction, and said something to the other man. "Yes," Lauren said. "I can come now." She stood, pocketed her phone, and moved toward the door. In the hallway, 2 nurses she recognized from her floor were talking in low voices and stopped when she appeared. They looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her since she'd arrived in Danton. Not contempt, not dismissal. Something else. Something she hadn't yet decided how to carry. She walked past them toward the elevator, and as the doors closed and she began to rise toward the floor where a 4-star general was waiting to meet the woman who had refused to let him die, her phone buzzed one more time. This one was a text from a number she didn't have saved, but the area code was local. 4 words. "Garrett's lawyer just arrived. She read the text twice, then put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. Garrett's lawyer arriving was not a surprise. It was, if anything, confirmation that the review had drawn enough blood that Garrett had decided the situation required professional insulation. Lawyers didn't show up to situations that were going well. They showed up to situations where the documentation was about to become someone's problem, and the only question left was whose. She stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor. The difference between the 4th floor and the unit where she'd been working was immediate and physical. There were 2 men in suits at the elevator bank. Not hospital security, not administration, federal. One of them tracked her as she came off the elevator without moving toward her, which meant she was expected, which meant James Aldridge had called ahead, or Voss had, or both. A nurse she didn't recognize led her down the hall without being asked to. Private room, corner unit. The curtain was half drawn. James Aldridge was standing near the window when she entered. He was in his 60s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that came from institutional conditioning rather than vanity. He was in civilian clothes, but wore them the way military men wore civilian clothes. Correctly, but like a second language. His handshake was brief and firm. "Ms. Mercer, thank you for coming." "Yes, sir." "James is fine." He stepped aside and Lauren turned to look at the bed. General Marcus Aldridge was propped up at an angle that would have required negotiation with the nursing staff. He was pale in the specific way of someone who had recently lost and been forcibly returned, with the trace bruising across his sternum that she recognized because she'd put it there. His eyes were open and clear. They were the eyes of a man who assessed things quickly and was doing so now. "So," he said. His voice was rougher than she expected. "You're the one." "I'm Lauren Mercer," she said. "I was your nurse." "Was." He caught the word. "They let you go." "They suspended me, yes." He looked at his son. James looked at the window. "Sit down," Aldridge said. It wasn't unfriendly, it was just how the man talked. She sat in the chair by the bed. He studied her the way people studied things they were trying to categorize. "Thurston tells me you didn't hesitate," he said. "There wasn't time to hesitate." "There's always time to hesitate. Most people find it." He shifted slightly against the pillow. The effort cost him something, and he didn't try to hide it, which she respected. "He also tells me you flagged my allergy card that morning." "I did." "And the order wasn't changed?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the parking lot below moved in its slow afternoon patterns. Lauren kept her hands in her lap and waited, because she had been in rooms with people like this before and understood that the thing they were saying was often not the first thing they said. "I put that card in my file 15 years ago, Aldridge said. "After a close call in Germany, the physician there almost gave me exactly what was on that order." He looked at the ceiling briefly. "I've been carrying that card since. Figured it would matter someday." "It did." "Because you looked." He moved his eyes back to her face. "Not everyone looks." She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one. "Army?" he said. "Yes, sir." "What unit?" 10th Mountain, 1st deployment, 2nd was Joint Forward Surgical Support. She paused. "I was a combat medic, later trauma specialist." He nodded slowly. Whatever he was measuring, he'd found enough of it. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Danton, Wyoming, civilian hospital. I needed something quieter." "Did you find it?" She almost laughed. It came out as a breath instead. "Not exactly." His mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent. "No, I don't suppose you did." She stayed for 22 minutes. Long enough for him to ask 3 more questions she answered honestly, and short enough that his energy didn't visibly flag before she left. James walked her to the door and stopped her in the hallway with a hand on her arm. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "My father's position means this situation is going to move faster than you might expect. The review, the personnel actions, all of it. That's not a threat or a promise. It's just how this works when his name is attached. I understand that. The nursing board complaint, Thurston told me it's suspended. It'll be withdrawn," James said. "Flat, certain. I want to make sure you know that. Whatever else happens in the next few days, that part is not in question." She looked at him. He had his father's eyes, that same quality of directness that didn't feel aggressive because it wasn't. It was just efficient. "Thank you," she said. She meant it and said it simply, which was the only way she knew how to say things she meant. He nodded and went back into the room, and Lauren walked back to the elevator bank past the federal agents who tracked her without appearing to, and pressed the button to go down. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Voss. "We need you in conference B, 20 minutes. Conference room B had transformed since the morning. The hospital's interior geography was the same: the laminate table, the fluorescent lights, the chairs with their wrong tilts. But the population of the room had shifted significantly, and the energy had shifted with it. Webb and Price were present, but they'd been repositioned, physically and otherwise. They were seated at one end rather than the center, and the center now belonged to Agent Reyes, who had set up a laptop and 2 external drives and a digital recorder in a configuration that communicated seriousness without trying to. Dr. Mull from the State Board was there. So was an attorney. Lauren didn't recognize who turned out to be from the Wyoming State Attorney General's office. Thurston sat to one side, separate from both factions, in the way of someone who had contributed their intelligence and was now observing the secondary detonations. Garrett was at the far end of the table. He had a lawyer beside him, a man named Farrow, according to the card visible on the table, in a suit that cost more than anything in this room had cost. Garrett himself was composed. That composure was his instrument, and he played it well. He had his own folder open. He was holding a pen. Lauren sat where Reyes indicated. The attorney from the AG's office looked at her briefly and made a small note. "Miss Mercer," Reyes said, "I want to revisit one specific element of your timeline, the morning of the incident. You noted the allergy card at 0917. At approximately 10:40, you had a brief interaction with Dr. Garrett's physician's assistant at the nurse's station. Can you describe that?" "I mentioned the allergy notation to the PA, a man named Trevor Holst. I asked whether Dr. Garrett had been informed about the updated flag and whether the standing order would be reviewed." "And what was the response?" "He told me the patient was stable and Dr. Garrett had reviewed the chart that morning. He suggested I focus on my own patient assignments." Reyes didn't react to this. She just wrote. Webb, at the far end, made a sound that could have been a sigh, or could have been something more deliberate. Sandra Price was looking at the table. "Mr. Holst," Reyes said, "has provided us with his account of that conversation." She slid a document across the table to the AG's attorney. Not to Lauren, not to Garrett's lawyer, to the AG's attorney. That sequencing was deliberate. His account confirms the substance of Ms. Mercer's description. He further indicates that he communicated the allergy update to Dr. Garrett verbally at approximately 11:10 that morning. Lauren looked at Garrett. He was still composed. The pen in his hand had stopped moving. "Dr. Garrett," Reyes said, "were you informed of the allergy flag at 11:10? Farrow put his hand on Garrett's arm. "My client, Dr. Garrett," Reyes said again, not changing her tone, "is not under formal interrogation at this time. He's participating voluntarily in an administrative review. He can answer or he can reserve, but his choice will be noted in the record." Farrow leaned toward Garrett and said something quietly. Garrett listened. Then he said, "I was made aware of a notation. I determined at that time that the patient's current orders were appropriate given his stable presentation." "You determined," Reyes said, "at 11:10, that the standing antiarrhythmic order was appropriate. His vitals were stable. His allergy card," Reyes said, "documents a documented contraindication that is not presentation dependent. The interaction risk exists regardless of whether the patient is presenting as stable." Garrett's jaw moved slightly. Clinical judgment involves more than reading a card. "And yet," Reyes said, "Miss Mercer's notation at 0917, which described exactly this risk in clinical language, is what the crash cart team would have referenced had she not been present during the event. And had she not been present, the standing order might have been administered." She paused. "That is not a hypothetical we're exploring for comfort. That is a documented risk that was not mitigated after being identified, communicated, and verified. Twice." The room was very quiet. Lauren was aware of Webb in her peripheral vision. He had the look of a man whose internal narrative about the situation had been running on one track and had just discovered the track didn't connect to where he thought it was going. Garrett left the room at 3:40 p.m. with Farrow close beside him. Lauren stayed. The session continued for another hour, detailed, procedural, exhausting in the specific way of institutional processes that had weight behind them. The AG's attorney asked her a series of questions about her documentation habits, her training background, and the specific clinical indicators she'd used to assess the cardiac event. She answered all of them. Her voice stayed level even when the questions circled back on themselves looking for inconsistency and didn't find any. At 5 o'clock, Reyes closed her laptop. "Ms. Mercer, thank you for your cooperation and your time today." She looked at Lauren directly. "The review will continue over the next several days. You should receive formal notification about the status of your professional standing from the state board within 48 hours. Lauren stood. She picked up her bag. She looked around the room, at Thurston, who gave her a small nod, at Mull, who was writing and didn't look up, at Webb, who finally met her eyes and looked away first. She walked out. In the hallway, she stood for a moment and breathed the recycled hospital air that smelled of cleaning solution and something underneath it she'd never been able to name but recognized from every medical facility she'd ever worked in. The smell of proximity to serious things. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, then a name in the follow-up text. "This is Paulette. I don't know if you want to hear from me, but I thought you should know. Danny talked to the investigator this afternoon. She told them she heard Garrett tell Holst to manage the provisional nurse's concerns after Holst came to him at 11:10. Those were his words, apparently. Manage. Paulette. Lauren read it twice. She typed back, "Thank you for telling me." She put the phone away and walked toward the exit, and outside the sky above Danton was doing what Wyoming skies did in October, moving fast, all pressure and color, like the weather was trying to make a decision. The next 48 hours had a particular texture she would remember later. She went home. She slept for 9 hours in a stretch that surprised her. She woke up and made food she actually tasted and sat at her kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, looking at nothing specific while her mind ran through the clinical sequence of Room 14, the way it sometimes ran through old cases. Not obsessively, but with the thorough quality of someone who needed to understand things completely before filing them away. She called her therapist in Laramie. Dr. Kessler picked up on the third ring and Lauren talked for 40 minutes, which was more than she usually said in a full session. Kessler listened with the specific quality of attention that Lauren had spent the first 3 months of treatment learning to receive without deflecting. "Are you okay?" Kessler said, eventually. "I don't know yet," Lauren said, "but I think I did the right thing." "You know you did," Kessler said. "That's different from being okay." Lauren thought about that for a while after she hung up. On the second morning, Voss called. "The preliminary findings are being formalized today. I can't tell you specifics, but I want you to be available this afternoon, 2 o'clock. "For what?" "A meeting at the hospital." "Who's going to be there?" "General Aldridge has requested to be present, his son, Thurston, the board rep." A pause. "The hospital executive team." "All of them?" "Webb and Price, yes, and the board chair, the hospital's legal counsel." Another pause, shorter. "Dr. Garrett will not be present." She absorbed that. 2 o'clock, she said. "We'll send a vehicle." "I'll drive myself," she said, for the second time. This time, Voss didn't argue. She arrived 8 minutes early and sat in her car in the parking lot until 2 o'clock exactly. Not because she was composing herself, she was already composed, but because arriving early to meetings like this was a form of eagerness she didn't feel and didn't want to perform. The room they used this time was the hospital's main boardroom on the executive floor, which Lauren had never been in. Long table, real chairs, windows that looked west toward the mountains. 12 people when she arrived. She took the empty seat between Thurston and the AG's attorney and set her bag on the floor and waited. General Aldridge arrived in a wheelchair, which he clearly objected to on principle, pushed by a nurse who had the look of someone who had argued with him about it and won on narrow grounds. He was in street clothes. He looked tired and alert simultaneously in the way of people with strong constitutions and recent serious medical events. He met Lauren's eyes across the room and gave her a nod that was too small to be significant and too deliberate to be accidental. Harrison Webb opened the session because it was his building, technically. He was reading from a prepared statement that his legal counsel had clearly written and he was doing it with the energy of a man trying to appear cooperative while buying time to assess what cooperative was going to cost him. Agent Reyes cut him off at the third paragraph. "Mr. Webb, the findings are ready to be shared. I'd like to move directly to that." She looked at the room. The DoD Inspector General's preliminary review, conducted in conjunction with the Wyoming State Medical Board and the State Attorney General's Office, has found the following. She read from a document. Her voice was even and precise in the way of people who understood that tone carried weight and didn't need to add any. The first finding: Lauren's defibrillation of Marcus Aldridge had been clinically indicated, properly executed, and was consistent with both her training and applicable Wyoming nursing statute for emergency situations without timely physician availability. The second finding, the allergy notation added by Lauren at 9:17 a.m. on the day of the event, documented a material contraindication that had been communicated to Dr. Garrett's PA at approximately 10:40 a.m. and verbally to Dr. Garrett himself at approximately 11:10 a.m. The third finding, Dr. Garrett had been informed of the allergy flag and had consciously elected not to modify the standing medication order, citing clinical judgment, despite the allergy card documenting a contraindication that was not dependent on the patient's presentation. The fourth finding, Dr. Garrett's incident report, filed in the hours following the event, contained characterizations of Lauren's clinical decision that were not supported by the objective monitor data and that served to misrepresent the sequence of events in a manner that shifted responsibility for a near-fatal outcome. Farrow, Garrett's attorney, had been invited to attend the reading but had declined. Lauren wondered if that was strategy or if Garrett had stopped taking his calls. The fifth finding, the one that changed the atmospheric pressure in the room, was this. The hospital's decision to initiate nursing board proceedings against Lauren Mercer had been made within 4 hours of the incident, prior to any clinical review of the monitor data, and appeared to have been based primarily on Dr. Garrett's characterization of events rather than independent assessment of the clinical record. Webb put his prepared statement down. The nursing board complaint filed by this hospital, Reyes said, is formally withdrawn, effective as of this morning, following agreement between the hospital's legal counsel and the state board. Ms. Mercer's provisional nursing privileges at this facility are reinstated immediately, and the hospital administration is directed to ensure her employment file reflects the findings of this review. The room was quiet. Lauren looked at the table. She was aware of the specific quality of the silence. Not empty, but weighted, the kind that happened after something had been said that reorganized how everyone present understood the preceding events. Aldridge spoke from his wheelchair. "I'd like to say something," he said. Nobody objected. He was a 4-star general, retired, and also the most consequential patient in this building's history. Objecting would have required energy no one in that room had. "The person who saved my life did so under conditions that this institution then punished her for," he said. He wasn't reading from anything. He spoke the way people who had given hundreds of briefings spoke, directly, without ornament, with the weight of meaning what he said. "I have spent 40 years in an institution that talks often about accountability and honor. I have seen both observed and both ignored. What happened to Ms. Mercer after she kept me alive is the kind of thing that happens when institutions choose to protect hierarchy over evidence." He looked at Webb. "I expect that to be understood clearly." Webb said, "Yes, General," with the tone of a man who had just been told his grade, and it was not what he'd hoped. Aldridge looked at Lauren. "I don't have adequate language for what you did," he said, "so I won't try to manufacture it. I'm alive. You made that true. I understand what it cost you." He paused. "I intend to make sure that cost is not the end of the story." She looked at him. She thought about telling him that the cost had been manageable, that she'd dealt with worse, that she wasn't interested in being repaid, all of which was true. She thought about the professional distance she'd maintained through the entire proceeding and how it had served her. Then she said, "Thank you, General." That was all. He nodded. Across the room, James Aldridge was looking at the window. His jaw was set. He blinked once. The boardroom session ended at 3:45 and immediately split into its component pieces: legal conversations, administrative conversations, the smaller negotiations that followed any significant institutional correction. Lauren found herself near the windows, alone for the first time in hours, looking west at the mountains while behind her the room worked out the logistics of consequence. Thurston appeared beside her. "What happens to Garrett?" she said. "His hospital privileges are suspended pending a formal medical board review," Thurston said. "The IG findings related to the incident report will be referred to the state medical board." He paused. "The misrepresentation in the incident report is the part that has teeth. Clinical judgment calls are difficult to prosecute. A report that demonstrably mischaracterizes a monitor strip, that's documentation fraud. How long does a medical board review take? Long. But the outcome, given what's been established, the findings will carry weight." She looked at the mountains. They were doing what they did in late afternoon, going dark at the edges while the peaks caught the last light in a way that made them look closer than they were. "And Webb? The board chair has initiated an internal governance review. The decision to file the nursing board complaint without independent clinical review, that's a liability question, and the hospital's counsel is already working on how to characterize it." He said this without satisfaction, but without pretense either. "Webb isn't a malicious person, I think. He's a person who believed the wrong person too quickly. That caused damage." "Yes, it did." He didn't try to soften it. "That's the thing about institutions. The damage caused by convenience is sometimes as significant as the damage caused by intent." Behind them, the room was clearing. She could hear Webb's voice, lower than it had been this morning, a different register, talking to the board chair. She didn't turn around. "What happens to me?" she asked. "You're reinstated, your record is corrected, the board complaint is withdrawn, the hospital is going to want to make a formal statement." He stopped. "Is there something specific you're asking?" She thought about conference room B yesterday morning, the chair that tilted wrong, Webb with his pen, Garrett's folded hands. "I'm asking whether I can go back to work," she said. "On my floor, with my patients." "Yes," Thurston said. "That's your choice. Nobody is going to tell you otherwise." She turned away from the window. Reyes was by the door, assembling documents into a case. She caught Lauren's eye briefly. There was nothing in that glance except acknowledgement, the small professional nod of one person to another who has done what was required. Lauren returned it. She picked up her bag from the chair where she'd left it. She moved toward the door. Aldridge's wheelchair was being maneuvered by his nurse toward the hallway, and James was beside him, his hand resting on his father's shoulder in the way of someone who had been frightened recently and was not quite finished with it. James met her eyes as she passed. He started to say something. She shook her head slightly, and he nodded, and she kept walking. She was in the elevator going down when her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, not a local area code, not a Wyoming number at all. The prefix was Virginia. She answered. "Ms. Mercer." A woman's voice, formal, crisp, the background sounds of somewhere official. "My name is Colonel Diane Westfield, Defense Health Agency. I've been reviewing the findings from the Danton Review, along with your service record." A pause. "I'd like to schedule a conversation about your next steps." The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the lobby. "What kind of conversation?" Lauren said. "The kind that tends to change things," Westfield said. Through the lobby's glass front, the parking lot was going amber in the late afternoon light. The same magpies that had been in her yard that morning, or birds exactly like them, were arguing on a light post near the entrance. She walked through the doors. The cold hit her face. Wyoming October, clean and absolute. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, if you're available." Another pause, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in Westfield's tone. Not warmth exactly, but specificity. "Ms. Mercer, your service record is not unknown to this office. The work you did in theater, the commendations, your specialty certifications, those don't stop mattering because you transitioned out." Lauren stood on the sidewalk outside Mercy Bluff General Hospital with her bag over one shoulder and the cold wind coming off the mountains at her back. "I'll be available at 8, she said. "We'll call at 8 sharp." The call ended. She stood there for a moment. Across the parking lot, a dark sedan she didn't recognize was parked at the far edge of the lot, and the person behind the wheel was on a phone. As she watched, the person, she couldn't tell from this distance whether it was a man or a woman, lowered the phone, looked toward the hospital entrance, and looked directly at her. Then the sedan's engine started. It didn't pull out of the lot. It just idled. Lauren looked at it for 3 seconds and then looked away, because she had enough information to understand that the situation she was standing in had more layers than she'd seen yet, and standing in a parking lot trying to identify a sedan was not how she was going to understand them. She walked to her car. She was reaching for her keys when her phone buzzed one more time. A text from Voss this time. "Don't talk to anyone about Westfield's call yet. I'll explain tomorrow. Stay local tonight." She read it. She read it again. Then she looked up from the phone, across the roof of her car, at the dark sedan still idling at the far end of the lot. The window was down now, just slightly. And in the cold October air, just barely visible at this distance, the person inside was watching her. She didn't move toward the sedan. She didn't look away from it either. 3 seconds. 4. Then the window went up and the sedan reversed out of its space slowly, with the deliberate patience of someone who wanted her to see them leaving, and pulled toward the lot exit without hurrying. Wyoming plates. She caught the first 3 characters before the angle changed. She wrote them on the back of her hand with the pen she kept in her jacket pocket, which was a habit left over from environments where details had operational consequences and your phone battery was not always reliable. Then she got in her car and drove home, taking a route that added 6 minutes and included 3 turns she didn't need to make. Nobody followed her. Or if they did, they were better at it than she was at noticing, which was possible but unlikely. Voss called at 7:40 the next morning, 20 minutes before Westfield was supposed to. "The sedan," Lauren said before he could open. A pause. "You got the plates." 3 characters. "Send them to me." He gave her a number that was different from the one he'd called from. "Lauren, and I'm using your first name because this is not an official call, Westfield's outreach to you was not coordinated through the review team." She was standing in her kitchen. Her coffee was getting cold on the counter. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning the Defense Health Agency has an interest in the review findings that goes somewhat beyond General Aldridge's medical care." He spoke carefully, with the specific cadence of someone choosing what to say by deciding what not to say first. "There are components of this situation that extend past what happened in that hospital room. I can't give you the full picture yet. What I can tell you is that Westfield is legitimate. She's who she says she is. Her credentials are real, but her interest in you is not entirely about the Danton incident." Lauren looked out the kitchen window. The yard was empty. 1 magpie on the fence post, that was all. "Then what is it about?" she said. "That's what I want to talk to you about before you talk to her." A pause. "Can you come in this morning? Before 8? Boss, it's 7:40. "I know. I'm sorry. There's a diner on Callaway Street, 3 blocks from the hospital. It's called Patty's. It's open." She knew the diner. She'd passed it every morning on her way to work and eaten there twice. Once alone, once with Paulette, who had ordered the eggs and spoken extensively about a custody arrangement Lauren was not really the right audience for. 20 minutes, she said. She drank the cold coffee in 2 pulls, picked up her keys, and left. Check. Voss was already there when she arrived, at a corner booth with his back to the wall in the way of people who chose seats with sight lines. He had coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched, and a manila envelope that he'd positioned with the closed end toward her. She sat. The waitress appeared and Lauren ordered black coffee and did not order food, because she wasn't hungry, and pretending otherwise seemed like a waste of everyone's time. When the waitress left, Voss said, "How much do you know about the Holbrook family?" "Jerome Holbrook, hospital board member, Garrett's VIP patient during the incident." She paused. "You told me Garrett had a long-standing relationship with them." "Long-standing is one way to put it." Voss pushed the envelope across the table slightly. Not to her, not away from her, just moving it, the way people moved objects when they were organizing their thoughts. "Jerome Holbrook is on the Mercy Bluff board. He's also on the advisory committee for 3 regional healthcare development projects in Wyoming and Montana. He's a significant local donor and a personal friend of 2 current state legislators." He looked at her. "He's also the reason Philip Garrett has been at this hospital for 15 years without a single formal review, despite 3 prior patient complaints." Lauren held her coffee cup and said nothing. The complaints were internal, filed by nurses, 2 of them, and by 1 resident who rotated through about 4 years ago. Voss picked up his coffee finally. They were reviewed by administration and closed without action. Garrett's relationship with Holbrook gave him access to the board chair in ways that made internal complaints manageable. Managed, Lauren said. Exactly. Like Holst was told to manage me. Yes. He set the cup down. The IG review opened the Aldridge situation. The Aldridge situation opened the medication log. The medication log opened the prior complaints. And the prior complaints? He stopped, looked at the envelope. 2 of the 3 prior complaints involve situations where Garrett's clinical documentation doesn't match the nursing notes. Not dramatically, subtly, small discrepancies in timeline and sequence that would be easy to miss if nobody was looking for them. But now someone's looking. Now someone is looking, he said, and the state AG's office is looking with them because one of the prior complainants, the resident from 4 years ago, filed a separate report with the state medical board that was somehow closed without investigation. The board is now reviewing how that happened. Lauren thought about the room full of people yesterday, the AG's attorney, the board rep, the way Reyes had directed the document to specific hands in a specific order. This was already bigger than Aldridge, she said. The Aldridge situation gave us the mechanism to move on something that had been sitting still for years, Voss said. Your documentation created a chain of evidence that couldn't be attributed to institutional bias because you had no history here. You'd been in this building 11 weeks. You had no relationship with any of the involved parties. You had no motive to target Garrett. He looked at her steadily. You just wrote what you saw. I always write what I see. I know. That's the point. The waitress refilled Lauren's coffee without being asked. Outside, Calloway Street was doing its modest morning business. A truck making a delivery, 2 people walking a dog with no urgency. The kind of ordinary Wednesday motion that didn't know anything significant was happening 3 blocks away. The sedan, Lauren said, in the parking lot. We're running the plates. We think it's connected to Holbrook's operation rather than Garrett directly. Someone watching how the review landed. He paused. It's not a threat. It's reconnaissance. That doesn't make it comfortable. No, he agreed. It doesn't. So who is Westfield? Really? Voss was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup on the table, once, the way people did when they were sequencing something internally. The Defense Health Agency has been running a separate track looking at Garrett's military consulting work, he said. He's been a contracted advisor for 2 military medical facilities in the region. That relationship created a documentation trail that intersects with the IG review in ways that the DHA wants to manage carefully. He met her eyes. Westfield is legitimate. Her interest in you is related to your service record, your specialty certifications, and what the Danton incident demonstrated about your clinical capability. But she's also going to want to talk to you about what you observed working under Garrett, what you saw, what you can put in a formal statement. She wants a witness. She wants the right witness, he said. Someone with standing, someone with a military record that establishes credibility. Someone who documented everything contemporaneously and can speak to the clinical realities without being framed as a disgruntled employee. Lauren looked at the envelope. What's in there? The prior complaints. Redacted, but the clinical substance is intact. He paused. You don't have to read them. But if you're going to talk to Westfield this morning, I thought you should understand the full shape of what you're in the middle of. She picked up the envelope. Amauchet. She read it in her car, parked on Calloway Street, with the heat running because October in Wyoming didn't negotiate. 2 complaints. The first was 4 years old, filed by a resident named Dr. Asha Nkosi during a surgical rotation. It described a situation in which Garrett had changed his post-operative notes after a patient developed a complication, altering the documented sequence of events in a way that shifted clinical responsibility. Nkosi had noticed because she'd read the original notes and then read the amended ones and the timestamps hadn't been updated properly. She'd filed. The complaint had been reviewed by Harrison Webb's predecessor. It had been closed. The second was 3 years old. A nurse named Grace Pham, who had apparently left the hospital within 6 months of filing. Her complaint described a pattern of Garrett misrepresenting nursing observations in his clinical documentation, taking credit for assessments made by floor nurses, attributing decisions to his own clinical judgment that had actually originated with staff. The complaint had been reviewed by Webb himself. It had been closed. Lauren sat with the envelope in her lap and looked at the pattern. Not dramatic fraud. Not missing patients or falsified cause of death reports. Something subtler and in some ways more corrosive. The systematic rewriting of the clinical record to ensure that all credit flowed upward, all blame flowed down, and the physician at the top of that hierarchy remained insulated from scrutiny by the very documentation that was supposed to hold him accountable. It was the same thing he'd tried to do to her. It was what he always did. He'd just never before done it to someone who had documented first. She folded the papers back into the envelope. She sat for another minute. Then she called Westfield. Quote. The call was 34 minutes long, and Lauren took it in the car, which turned out to be fine because Westfield didn't require a formal setting. She required attention and accuracy, both of which Lauren could provide regardless of location. Westfield was direct in the way of people who managed significant information regularly and didn't have patience for the social softening that usually preceded it. She confirmed what Voss had told Lauren. The DHA's consulting contract review had flagged Garrett's involvement in 2 regional military medical facilities, and the documentation patterns in his consulting reports resembled the patterns now identified in his hospital record. The consulting work is where this gets federal, Westfield said. Hospital misconduct is a state matter primarily, but when a contracted DoD consultant is falsifying clinical documentation in a way that affects military facility protocols, she paused. That's a different conversation. What do you need from me? A formal statement on record describing your direct observations during the 11 weeks you worked under Garrett's department. Not just the Aldridge incident, everything. Patient interactions you observed, documentation practices you noticed, the culture of the floor. Another pause. You're a trained observer, Ms. Mercer. You documented in real time. What you have in your head and in those timestamps is more useful than you may realize. When? This week, if possible. We can come to Danton. A slight shift in tone. I also want to discuss your situation going forward. Your reinstatement, the board withdrawal. Those are resolved. But given your background and what this review has demonstrated, I think there's a conversation worth having about what comes next for you professionally. Lauren looked through the windshield. A woman was walking past on the sidewalk with a grocery bag, and a kid who was not cooperating with the pace she was trying to maintain. The kid wanted to look at something on the ground. The woman wanted to move. Neither of them was entirely winning. Let's start with the statement, Lauren said. We can talk about the rest after. Fair enough, Westfield said. I'll have someone contact you with logistics by noon. The call ended. Lauren sat for another moment, then started the car and drove back to the hospital because she had a shift in 4 hours and whatever else was happening, her patient still needed a nurse. Returning to the floor was not the smooth re-entry that administrative reinstatement implied it would be. Her badge worked on the first try, which was something. Paulette was at the nurse's station and made eye contact immediately and said, "You're back," with the tone of someone who had been hoping for this and was relieved enough not to be subtle about it. Marcus, the orderly, nodded at her from across the hall. He looked like he wanted to say something and couldn't locate it. Danny Keyes was at the medication cart with her back to Lauren's arrival, and she stayed that way for longer than the task required. Lauren changed in the staff locker room, pulled her hair back, and went to review the morning's patient charts with the concentrated focus of someone for whom work had always been the most reliable available reality. 3 new admissions, 2 patients carried over from her prior shifts, dosage checks, vitals patterns, follow-up orders. The floor had its own logic, distinct from everything happening in the administrative levels above it, and she moved into that logic the way she moved into most things she was good at, without announcing it. 40 minutes into the shift, Danny appeared at the documentation station where Lauren was working. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood with her arms crossed, which was Danny's default posture in situations where she was uncertain but didn't want to appear uncertain. "I talked to the investigator," Danny said finally. "I know," Lauren said. She kept her eyes on the screen. "I should have—" Danny stopped. "I didn't realize what Garrett was. I didn't think he was—" Another stop. "I thought you were just the provisional nurse who stepped out of line." Lauren finished the notation she was making before she responded, not as a power move, because the notation needed to be finished. "I was the provisional nurse," she said. That part was accurate. "You know what I mean." She turned to look at Danny then. Danny looked for the first time Lauren could recall, uncertain in a way that wasn't performing anything, just uncertain. "I know what you mean," Lauren said. "Thank you for telling them what you heard." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't not forgiveness. It was the acknowledgement of a fact. Danny had told the truth when it mattered, which was the minimum required, and Lauren wasn't going to pretend it was more than that or less than that. Danny nodded and went back to the medication cart. The shift continued. Bossy. At 1:15 p.m., Lauren was in the middle of a wound check on a post-surgical patient when Paulette appeared in the doorway with an expression that communicated something significant had happened at a level above the floor. "Administration just called down," Paulette said quietly. "They're asking all department heads to report to the executive level. Building-wide notification." She paused. "I think it's about Garrett." Lauren finished the wound check. She documented it. She told her patient she'd check back in an hour and stepped out of the room. In the hallway, the floor had the particular electric quality of a space where people knew something was happening but didn't yet know what it was. Nurses at the station were talking in low voices. Two of Garrett's former residents were standing near the elevator looking at one another. She didn't go upstairs. She wasn't invited, and she didn't need to be there to understand what was happening. The review findings were being formally communicated to the hospital administration. The consequences she'd watched being constructed over the past 48 hours were being handed to the people who had the authority to execute them. She went back to her patients. She was charting at the nurse's station at 2:40 when her phone buzzed. Voss. Garrett's hospital privileges have been formally suspended pending medical board review. Webb has been placed on administrative leave pending the governance investigation. Full statement from hospital board chair at 4 o'clock. You might want to be available. She looked at the text for a moment. Then she put the phone back in her scrubs pocket and finished the chart entry she'd been working on. Bump. The hospital board chair's statement was delivered at 4 o'clock in a conference room that Lauren was not in, but it was recorded and distributed to staff within 20 minutes. And she read it on her phone in the stairwell between the second and third floors where she ate lunch, which had apparently become her space for receiving information about her own life. The statement was formal and carefully worded in the way of institutional language designed to communicate accountability while minimizing litigation exposure. But the substance was clear. Dr. Philip Garrett's clinical privileges at Mercy Bluff General Hospital were suspended immediately, pending the outcome of the Wyoming State Medical Board's review of findings from the DoD Inspector General's investigation. Harrison Webb was on administrative leave. An independent clinical review panel would examine all patient outcomes in Garrett's department over the previous 4 years. 4 years. That was how far back they were going. That was the second complaint, the one by Grace Pham, who'd left within 6 months of filing. Someone had decided to look at the full time frame. The statement also noted in its final paragraph that the hospital was initiating a patient notification process for those whose care had involved documentation anomalies identified during the review. That paragraph was going to generate more action than everything preceding it. That was how these things worked. The institutional statements were for the record. The patient notifications were for the lawyers. Lauren put her phone away and sat in the stairwell for a few minutes with the clean, solid silence of the space around her. She thought about Grace Pham, whoever she was, wherever she was now. She thought about Asha Nkosi, the resident who'd noticed the amended timestamps 4 years ago and filed a complaint that went nowhere and had presumably spent the intervening time wondering if it had meant anything. Now, it meant something. Because Lauren had arrived 11 weeks ago and documented in real time and saved a 4-star general's life on a Tuesday afternoon, and the thread that got pulled had unraveled more than anyone initially saw. She hadn't known any of that when she ran to room 14. She'd known there was a man in V-fib and a crash cart in the hallway. That was enough. That had always been enough. She called Dr. Kessler that evening, not because she'd planned to, but because she was sitting in her kitchen again looking at nothing specific and realized she had too much in her head to process alone efficiently. "You sound different," Kessler said. "Different how?" A pause. Less braced. Lauren thought about that. "Maybe," she said. How's the guilt?" "Which guilt?" "Pick one." Lauren turned her coffee cup on the table. "Garrett is being reviewed. Webb is on leave. It's going further back than just my situation. There are other nurses, patients." She stopped. "I don't feel guilty. I feel She looked for the word. Heavy. Like something I didn't know I was carrying has been put down, but now I can feel where it was. That's not guilt, Kessler said. That's the beginning of the other thing. What other thing? The thing that comes after you've been fighting long enough to forget you were fighting. Lauren didn't have a response to that. She sat with it for a while, which Kessler was comfortable with. That was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about these calls. Kessler didn't treat silence as a problem to solve. Someone from the Defense Health Agency wants to talk to me, Lauren said eventually, about what happens next, professionally. Are you afraid of that? No. She thought about it more carefully. I don't know what I want yet. That's different from afraid. Yes, Kessler said. It is. They talked for another 20 minutes. When she hung up, the kitchen was darker than she'd noticed. She'd been sitting without turning on the lights as the afternoon became evening. She got up and turned on the light above the sink and stood there looking at the yellow circle it cast on the counter. Tomorrow she'd give her formal statement to the DHA. The day after, she'd be back on her floor. The day after that, she didn't know yet. And for the first time in 11 weeks, the not knowing felt less like a wall and more like a space. The DHA interview was conducted the following morning in a conference room at the Danton Municipal Building. Neutral ground, not the hospital, which was Westfield's choice, and communicated something about how she ran things. Westfield was 50, compact, precise in the way of someone whose precision had been professionally sharpened over a long time. She shook Lauren's hand once, set up the recorder, and began. They went for 3 hours. Lauren described everything she'd observed during her 11 weeks on Garrett's floor. Her observations were specific, temporal, and clinical. She described the culture of the department, the pattern of how Garrett interacted with floor nursing staff, the way his documentation was filed, the 2 occasions prior to the Aldridge incident when she'd noticed discrepancies between verbal physician orders and what appeared in the chart, and how she'd logged her own nursing notes with timestamps, specifically because something about those discrepancies made her want a contemporaneous record. She hadn't known at the time what she was recording. She had just recorded it, because that was what you did. Westfield listened with the specific quality of attention that meant she was already connecting dots as Lauren provided them. When they finished, Westfield sat back and looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite anything Lauren had a clean word for. You've been doing this your whole career, Westfield said, documenting, precisely and in real time. Yes, even before the Army? It's how I think, Lauren said. Things happen in sequence. The sequence matters. Do you know what that kind of thinking is worth in a formal investigation? Westfield said. Not rhetorically, an actual question. I'm beginning to understand. Westfield nodded. Let's talk about what you want. She folded her hands on the table in the way of someone settling in for a different kind of conversation. Not what we're asking you for, what you actually want. Lauren looked at her. It was not the question she'd expected from someone in Westfield's position, which was exactly why it landed differently than the morning's other questions. I want to do the work, Lauren said, the clinical work. I'm a good nurse. I'm better than that, actually, and I know that's not a humble thing to say. It's an accurate thing to say, Westfield said. I want to do it somewhere the documentation means something. Somewhere the decisions I make go through a chain that doesn't have a Garrett sitting in it. That's fair. Lauren stopped. She wasn't sure she was ready to say this to a federal official she'd met yesterday. Go ahead, Westfield said. I didn't leave the Army because I wanted to leave medicine behind. I left because I needed to leave what the Army had become for me at that point. Those are 2 different things. She paused. I've been treating them like they're the same thing. Westfield was quiet for a moment. We have a position, she said. It's not a nursing position. It's a program role. Trauma protocol development for military medical facilities, specifically forward surgical units. The kind of work your specialty certifications and your field experience would contribute to directly. She looked at Lauren. You'd be advising on the protocols that the next generation of forward medics work under, based on what people like you learned in theater. Lauren looked at the table. It's based in Colorado, Westfield said, or it can be remote substantially if you prefer Wyoming. I'd need to think about it. Of course. Can I have a week? You can have 2, Westfield said. You've earned the time. She stood. Lauren stood. They shook hands again, and this time the handshake had a different weight. Not the formal opening of an institutional process, but the close of one. Lauren walked out of the municipal building into the October morning. Cold, clear, the mountains to the west doing their permanent excellent job of making human concerns feel appropriately scaled. Her phone was in her pocket. She didn't take it out. She was halfway to her car when someone called her name from across the parking lot. She turned. A man she didn't recognize. Mid-50s in civilian clothes that weren't quite civilian. The posture was wrong, the shoes were wrong. The way he stood was wrong in the specific way of someone trained to occupy space with purpose. He was walking toward her with the directional certainty of someone who'd been waiting for her to exit. He stopped about 6 feet away. He didn't offer his hand. "Ms. Mercer." His voice was flat. "You don't know me. My name is Frank Holbrook." She held very still. Jerome Holbrook's son, she would confirm later. 30-ish. The one who managed the family's regional business interests while Jerome sat on hospital boards and advisory committees. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said. "I want to be clear about that up front." "Okay," she said. "Be clear. My father is a private citizen who has supported this hospital for 22 years. What's happening right now?" He paused, something working behind his eyes. "The scope of this review is going to damage people who had nothing to do with what happened to that patient. Your father's relationship with Garrett allowed Garrett to dismiss 2 prior complaints," she said. "That's documented. My father supported a physician who was well regarded in this community for 15 years. He didn't review clinical notes. He isn't a doctor. He's on the board. Board members aren't medical reviewers." Lauren looked at him steadily. He was trying to draw a line between influence and responsibility, and it was the kind of line that looked solid until you held it up to the light. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I want to understand what you've told the investigators about my father's involvement." She looked at him for a long moment. "I told them what I observed," she said. "I observed Garrett's clinical conduct. I observed the floor's culture. I observed my own incident. I don't have personal knowledge of your father's relationship with Garrett. I'd never heard his name before this week." Something in Frank Holbrook's posture shifted fractionally. Not relief, not that clean, but a recalibration. "Then it's the board records," he said, half to himself. "The complaint logs." "Those are institutional records," Lauren said. "I didn't produce them. I didn't access them. They exist because Grace Pham and Oshin and Kosi filed them 3 and 4 years ago." He looked at her. She looked back. The morning wind came through the parking lot and neither of them moved. "My father is not Garrett," he said. "I know," she said. "That's also not my determination to make." He stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward a silver truck at the lot's edge. He got in. He drove away. Lauren watched him go and then stood in the parking lot for a while because she wanted to give her pulse a moment to return to its baseline before she drove anywhere. She was reaching for her keys when her phone buzzed. "Voss." She answered. "Where are you?" he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not urgency, exactly. Compressed energy, like something had just happened fast and he was still processing the speed of it. "Parking lot, DHA interview is done. Get back to the hospital, not your floor. The administrative wing, executive level." "Why?" A beat. "Garrett gave a statement to the state medical board this morning," Voss said, "without his lawyer present. We don't have the full text yet, but we have enough." Another beat, and she could hear him moving, the sound of a hallway, a door. "He named Jerome Holbrook in the statement, directly. Named him as the person who instructed Webb to close the prior complaints." Lauren's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "Garrett gave up Holbrook," she said. "Garrett gave up Holbrook," Voss confirmed, "which means Holbrook's attorney just arrived at the state AG's office. And Webb's attorney filed a motion 40 minutes ago that references the same dynamic, suggesting Webb acted under direction." He paused. "The 3 of them are pointing at each other, and the documentation your timestamps produced is the fixed point none of their stories can move." She stood in the cold parking lot with the phone to her ear and the mountains at the edge of her vision and let the shape of it settle. 3 men, each now calculating that the safest available option was to be the first one to be believed. And the reason their calculations were desperate was sitting in a nursing timestamp logged at 9:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. By a provisional nurse nobody had bothered to learn the name of. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said. She got in the car. She started it. She pulled toward the lot exit and was at the first intersection when it occurred to her that Frank Holbrook had come to the parking lot this morning to assess what she'd told investigators about his father, and had driven away believing she had no personal knowledge of Jerome Holbrook's involvement, and had gone directly to wherever he'd gone next. And somewhere in that sequence, she thought, there was a thing she hadn't yet accounted for. She turned onto the main road and headed toward the hospital, and her phone buzzed one final time. Not Voss, not Westfield, not a number she recognized. A single text, no name attached. "My father knew about the Nkosi complaint before Webb closed it. He told Garrett personally. I have the emails. What do I do with them?" She read it at the next stoplight. The sender was Frank Holbrook. The light turned green and Lauren didn't move. The car behind her waited 2 full seconds before tapping its horn, and she pulled forward on reflex while her eyes stayed on the text. "My father knew about the Nkosi complaint before Webb closed it. He told Garrett personally. I have the emails. What do I do with them?" She pulled into the first available space on the street, a loading zone she was technically not allowed to use, and sat with the engine running and the phone in both hands. Frank Holbrook had walked across that parking lot 20 minutes ago to find out how exposed his father was. He'd driven away believing Lauren had no direct knowledge of Jerome's involvement, and somewhere between that parking lot and wherever he'd gone, he'd made a decision that had nothing to do with Lauren and everything to do with whatever he'd found when he looked at his father clearly. She typed, "Call Agent Voss at this number." She pasted Voss's contact. "Tell him exactly what you told me. Do it now, before anyone advises you not to." She stared at the message for 3 seconds. Then she sent it. She pulled back into traffic and drove to the hospital. Voss was in the executive hallway when she arrived, standing outside a closed door with his phone pressed to his ear and the look of someone managing 3 conversations simultaneously. He saw her, held up one finger, finished whatever he was saying in 4 words she couldn't hear, and lowered the phone. "Frank Holbrook texted me," she said. "I know. He called me 30 seconds after you gave him my number." Voss looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite surprised, but the cousin of it. The version that lived in people who thought they'd mapped a situation and then discovered an unmapped room. He has 47 emails, between Jerome Holbrook and Philip Garrett, over 4 years, including 3 that directly reference the Nkosi complaint by name. Lauren held very still. "Jerome told Garrett the complaint would be handled," Voss said. "In writing. He said it in an email. The phrase he used was, 'I'll make sure this lands softly.' Then 3 days later, Webb closed it without investigation." "Holbrook put it in writing," she said. "Jerome Holbrook is 71 years old and believed for 20 years that his position in this community was permanent infrastructure," Voss said. "People who feel that permanent get careless. They stop treating their communications like evidence because they've never had to." Lauren looked at the closed door. "What's happening in there?" "The board chair is meeting with the hospital's legal team and the AG's office. Webb's attorney and Garrett's attorney both requested emergency meetings this morning and were told to wait." He paused. "Frank Holbrook is driving to the AG's office right now with a printed copy of the emails." She looked at Voss. "Why did he do it?" she said. "He came to that parking lot to protect his father." Voss was quiet for a moment. "I asked him that. On the phone." He looked at the wall briefly, then back at her. "He said he'd spent the drive back to his office going through the timeline in his head. And he said," these were his words, "My father let people get hurt so Garrett could stay comfortable. I can't make that smaller than it is." The hallway was quiet. From somewhere below them, the hospital's ambient sounds, monitors, carts, voices, moved upward through the structure in the way of background noise that had its own kind of constancy. "He's going to lose his father over this," Lauren said. "Probably not lose him," Voss said. "But the relationship they had, the version where Frank looked away from certain things because looking at them was inconvenient, that version is done." He put his phone in his jacket pocket. "That's a real cost. People don't make that choice easily." She thought about what she'd told Kessler. The thing she'd been carrying without knowing it was weight. Frank Holbrook had been carrying something similar for 4 years, and had spent one car ride deciding he was done. People surprised her sometimes, not often enough to make her optimistic in any general sense, but enough to keep the specific case open. The AG's office released a formal statement at 5:20 that afternoon. Lauren read it on Paulette's phone in the break room because her own phone was charging in her locker and she'd finished her shift 20 minutes ago, but hadn't quite left yet. Sitting with a cup of tea, she wasn't really drinking while the floor settled into its evening rhythm around her. The statement was 4 paragraphs. In plain language, stripped of its legal scaffolding, it said, Jerome Holbrook had been formally named as a subject in the state AG's investigation into the suppression of medical complaints at Mercy Bluff General Hospital. Email evidence suggested direct communication between Holbrook and Dr. Philip Garrett regarding the handling of 2 prior patient care complaints. The investigation would examine the relationship between Holbrook's board position and the administrative decisions made by former Director of Medical Operations, Harrison Webb. Former. Harrison Webb was former. She handed the phone back to Paulette. Paulette read the statement, then read it again, and set the phone on the table. Jerome Holbrook has been on the hospital's gala committee for 12 years, Paulette said, not defensively, just processing. I know, Lauren said. He gave the money for the pediatric wing renovation. I know that too. Paulette looked at the phone. Then she looked at Lauren. Does it bother you that someone who did that kind of thing in the community could also... Yes, Lauren said. It was the simplest, honest answer. It bothers me because it's a real thing that happens. People can be multiple things at once. That doesn't make it easier. It just makes it real. Paulette was quiet for a moment. What happens to the patients, she said. The ones from the 4-year review, the ones whose charts had anomalies. They get notified. They get reviewed. Some of them find out that what they were told about their own care wasn't accurate. Lauren wrapped her hands around the tea mug, even though it had gone cold. That's the part that doesn't have a clean ending. Their situation doesn't resolve the same way mine does. Paulette looked at the table. That's not fair. No, Lauren agreed. It isn't. They sat with that for a minute because some things deserve to be sat with rather than immediately resolved into something more comfortable. The state medical board's formal notification arrived in Lauren's email at 7:45 the next morning. She was in her kitchen, same chair, different light. The early morning kind that came in at an angle and made the room look cleaner than it was. She read the email twice. The language was official and dense, but the substance was navigable. The complaint filed against her by Mercy Bluff General Hospital had been formally withdrawn. Her nursing license was confirmed in full standing. The board noted, in language that was careful but specific, that her clinical conduct during the incident in question had been reviewed against applicable statute and professional standards and found to be consistent with both. At the bottom, a single additional line that wasn't boilerplate. The board acknowledges Miss Mercer's contemporaneous documentation practices as exemplary. Exemplary. In a state board document. She read that word once more and then closed the email and sat back. Her phone buzzed. A number she'd saved 2 days ago. James Aldridge. I wanted to call personally, he said, rather than through channels. Thank you. My father would like to see you again, if you're willing. A pause. He's being discharged tomorrow. Before he leaves, he asked if you'd come. Yes, she said. Tell me when. 11 o'clock. I'll let the floor know. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table without doing anything else for a few minutes. Outside, the Wyoming morning was doing what it did at this hour in October. Gray at the edges, bright in the center, the sky the particular shade of pale blue that looked cold even when photographed somewhere warm. She thought about what Westfield had offered, the protocol development role, advising the people who would write the procedures that the next generation of forward medics would work under, passing forward something she'd learned at cost. She thought about Kessler's phrase, the thing that comes after you've been fighting long enough to forget you were fighting. She was still sitting there when the magpie landed on the fence post. Same bird or an indistinguishable one. She'd never been able to tell. It sat there for a moment doing nothing in particular, and then it left. Garrett's formal suspension from clinical practice pending medical board review was made public through the state board's daily bulletin that morning. It was the kind of notice that went out routinely, in dry regulatory language, but which, in a town the size of Danton, had the impact of something considerably less routine. By noon, Lauren had received 11 text messages from numbers she recognized to varying degrees. Nurses from the floor, a resident she'd spoken to twice, Marcus the orderly, and 2 nurses she'd never worked with from the hospital's surgical wing who had apparently gotten her number through Paulette and wanted her to know they'd filed their own statements with the board review. She answered the ones that required answers. The others she read and set aside, not because she was ungrateful, but because the volume of it, the sudden visibility after 11 weeks of being the provisional nurse nobody noticed, was something she needed to manage carefully. Recognition, she'd learned in other contexts, could be as destabilizing as its absence if you weren't paying attention to what it was doing to you. She'd had 2 commendations in her military career. Both times, the ceremony had felt stranger than the event that produced it. The event had been immediate and clear. There was a problem. She addressed it. Someone lived. The ceremony was a different grammar entirely, and she'd never gotten fluent in it. This was the same thing at a different scale. She put her phone face down on the table and went for a walk. Danton in late October was a specific kind of place. The tourist infrastructure shut down. The seasonal workers gone. The town returned to itself. Streets that had been moderately busy all summer now moved at a pace that matched the cold. Pickup trucks and practical sedans. A hardware store doing steady business. The diner on Callaway with its closed sign flipped to open, and the same 2 men who always seemed to be at the counter. She walked for 40 minutes, no particular direction. She walked past the turn to the hospital and kept going. She walked until the town thinned to its edges and there was a clear view west to where the mountains had gone dark with cloud at the ridgeline. She stood at the edge of a field that belonged to someone she didn't know and looked at the mountains. She thought about the decision in room 14, the 4 minutes, the specific quality of the stillness in that room just before the monitor resolved, the moment between action and outcome where you didn't know yet whether it had been enough, where the math was finished and you were waiting on the result. She'd lived in that moment in various forms for her entire adult life, made decisions under that kind of pressure. So many times the pressure had become its own familiar country, one she understood the geography of better than most places she'd actually lived. The question she'd been circling for 18 months, since she'd signed her discharge papers and driven out of Fort Carson for the last time, was not whether she was good at the work. She'd always known she was good at it. The question was whether the work was still hers, whether she'd used it up or it had used her up, and whether the distinction mattered. Standing at the edge of that field in Danton, Wyoming, she thought she was beginning to understand the answer. The work was still hers. It had never stopped being hers. She just needed to find it again in a context that didn't carry the specific weight of everything she'd needed to put down. She turned around and walked back toward town. Jerome Holbrook was formally charged by the Wyoming State AG's office on a Thursday, 10 days after the hospital board statement. 2 counts of obstruction related to the suppression of the Nkosi complaint, and 1 count of improper influence of a public process related to Webb's decision to close the FAM complaint without investigation. Lauren read the charging document on her lunch break. It was public record, available online, and she read it the way she read clinical documentation, methodically, from the beginning, not skipping anything. The emails were referenced in the charges. The language was specific. Communications establishing that Mr. Holbrook directed Dr. Garrett to reassure administrative staff that the complaint would be managed, and that such reassurance constituted improper influence on an administrative process designed to protect patient safety. Managed. The word that Garrett had used about her, the morning after the Aldridge incident. The word Danny had overheard. The word, it turned out, that Jerome Holbrook had been using for years, in a different direction, but with the same intention. She closed the document and finished her lunch. The floor that afternoon was busy in the particular way of midweek hospital business. 3 discharges, 2 new admissions, a medication reconciliation that took 40 minutes and required 3 phone calls to sort out. She worked through all of it. She answered questions from the 2 new nurses Paulette had assigned to shadow her this week, both of whom were recent graduates who moved through the floor with the slightly over-careful quality of people who understood the weight of what they were learning. She thought about what she would tell them if they asked her what the most important thing was. She'd never been a natural teacher. She communicated better through demonstration than instruction, but she was beginning to understand that demonstration was its own form of instruction, and that you didn't always choose your students. One of the new nurses, a young man named Derek with precise hands and a tendency to hesitate at decision points, asked her at the end of the shift how she decided when to act versus when to wait for authorization. She looked at him for a moment. "You read the patient," she said, "not the protocol. The patient first. The protocol is a tool, not a substitute for judgment." She paused. "And you document. You document everything in real time with timestamps, not because you expect something to go wrong, because documentation is how you protect the patient and yourself both. The record is the only thing that doesn't change after the fact." He wrote something in the small notebook he kept in his scrubs pocket. "What if someone tells you you're overstepping?" he said. She thought about conference room B, about the tilted chair and Webb's clicking pen and Garrett's folded hands. "You might be," she said. "You have to know the difference between overstepping and seeing something that needs to be addressed. That difference is usually clinical. What does the patient actually need? Start there. If you're right about the patient, the rest of it, the authorization issues, the chain of command, those become manageable problems." She looked at him steadily. "If you're wrong about the patient, none of the rest of it matters anyway." He nodded slowly. "And if you're right, and they still come after you, then you have your documentation," she said, "and you don't apologize for the decision that kept someone alive." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was trying to decide how much of this to believe and arriving at most of it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. It was the most military thing anyone had said to her in 18 months, and she felt it land in some specific place she didn't have a name for. At 11 o'clock the following morning, Lauren took the elevator to the 4th floor. General Aldridge was dressed when she arrived. Street clothes, jacket, the particular readiness of a man impatient with the logistics of departure. His wheelchair was folded in the corner, and she noted, with some clinical disapproval she kept to herself, that he was standing rather than using it. James was there. A military aide she hadn't met, a young woman with a lieutenant's insignia, stood near the door handling paperwork. Aldridge looked at Lauren when she came in and didn't say anything immediately, which she'd come to understand was how he operated. He took in whatever he was looking at before speaking, the same way she did. "You look like you slept," he said. "I did, finally. Good." He moved to the chair by the window and sat, not because he needed to, but because the standing had been a statement and he'd made it. "Sit." She sat. "The board findings," he said. "The charges. You know about all of it." "Yes." "How are you?" She thought about giving him the same answer she'd given Thurston. "I'm managing." But he'd asked a more specific question than that, and he deserved a more specific answer. "It's strange," she said. "I spent 11 weeks in this hospital being invisible. Then I spent 2 weeks being very visible for all of this. Neither of those things is really who I am." She paused. "I'm figuring out the version in between." He considered that. "That's an honest answer." "I try." "Your instinct," he said. "In that room, to run the chart, find the card, flag the allergy. You did that on your first real look at my file." "It was a laminated card in a clear sleeve," she said. "Someone put it there specifically so it would be found." "You're the first person who looked." She held his gaze. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the parking lot below moved in its usual patterns, indifferent to everything that had happened in this building over the past 2 weeks. "I put that card in my file 15 years ago," he said, "because I learned in Germany that the difference between dying and not dying was sometimes a piece of information that existed but that nobody was paying enough attention to read." He looked at her. "You paid attention." "That's the job," she said. "No," he said. "It's more than the job. Doing the job the way it's supposed to be done. Actually doing it. Not performing it. Not doing it when it's easy and convenient. That's more than the job. Most people don't." He was direct about it. Not complimentary, just stating what he'd observed in 40 years of watching people perform under pressure. "You do." She didn't deflect it. She received it the way Kessler had been teaching her to receive things that were true and uncomfortable, without dismissal, without inflation. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. James stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the door. He was holding an envelope. "My father wanted this to be documented," James said. "Not just verbally." He held the envelope out to her. A formal letter of commendation. From him personally. In addition to whatever comes through the official channels. She took the envelope. It had weight to it, actual physical stationery, not a printout. There's also, James said, a call we've made to the Defense Health Agency. He paused. We didn't tell them what to offer you. That's not how my father operates, but we made sure they understood the full picture of who they're talking to. Lauren looked at Aldridge. I don't pull strings on people's careers, he said. I make sure the right people have the right information. What you do with the opportunity is your business. Westfield's offer, Lauren said. Whatever she offered you, consider it real and fully supported. He held her gaze. You have standing, Ms. Mercer. Not from my recommendation, from what you did. My recommendation just ensures nobody buries that in a file cabinet. She looked at the envelope in her hands. Her name was written on the front in handwriting that was compressed and deliberate, the kind formed by someone who'd signed thousands of documents and never stopped treating each signature as something that mattered. I've been trying to figure out, she said slowly, what I want the next chapter to look like. I left the Army because something in me needed to step back from it. But I think I was confusing the institution with the work. The institution wore me down. The work... She stopped. The work is still the most real thing I know how to do. Then do it, he said, in whatever form makes sense. The DHA role, she said. Protocol development, forward medical units. She looked at him. That's the work, just at a different level. Yes, he said. It is. She stood. He stood, didn't ask for help, didn't reach for anything, just stood, because that was also just how he was. They shook hands. His grip was still solid, still the hand of someone who'd been physically capable for a long time. She felt the slight tremor in it, the residual artifact of what his heart had been through, and said nothing about it. Finish the mission, he said. It was what she'd said to him the first time they'd met in this room. She hadn't been sure he'd remember. Yes, sir, she said. She walked out. Harrison Webb resigned formally the following week, citing personal reasons, which was the language people used when the reasons were institutional and not personal at all. But everyone agreed to accept the framing because the result was the same. The hospital board appointed an interim director, a woman named Carolyn Fitch, who had run a regional hospital in Montana and who, in her first communication to staff, used the phrase culture of documentation accountability in a way that suggested she'd been briefed thoroughly on how Mercy Bluff had gotten here. Philip Garrett's case before the state medical board was scheduled for formal hearing in the spring. The IG findings, the documentation discrepancies, the Nkosi complaint emails, and the amended post-operative notes from 4 years ago were all part of the evidentiary file. His attorney had requested multiple continuances. The board had granted 2 and denied the third. Shucks it. The hearing would take the better part of a week, and would, when it concluded, result in the permanent revocation of Garrett's Wyoming medical license and a 5-year prohibition on applying for licensure in any other state. He would not practice medicine again. That outcome was not immediate. It took 4 months, but it was complete, and it was public, and it was recorded in the state board's permanent case record where anyone looking would find it. Jerome Holbrook accepted a plea agreement in February. 2 counts reduced to 1, a significant fine, and a 5-year prohibition on serving on any healthcare-related board or advisory committee in Wyoming. His attorneys called it a resolution. The AG's office called it accountability. Jerome Holbrook himself said nothing publicly. His lawyer said it for him, in a prepared statement that 3 newspapers ran, and most people read with the specific feeling of watching something that had been a long time arriving finally arrive. Frank Holbrook sold his Wyoming properties that spring and relocated to Denver. He sent Lauren a single text message after the plea agreement was announced. He's still my father. But I'd do it again. She read it twice and didn't respond because there wasn't anything she could say that was more precise than what he'd already said. The formal reinstatement ceremony, if it could be called that, which Lauren would have resisted but Paulette insisted upon, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the hospital's main conference room, which was a different Tuesday than the one that had started all of this but carried its own particular weight. Carolyn Fitch presided over it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who understood ceremony as a tool for marking transitions rather than celebrating participants. She presented Lauren with a document, official, framed, which Lauren had not expected and was not sure what to do with, acknowledging her clinical judgment, her documentation practices, and her role in initiating a review that had resulted in meaningful institutional reform. The phrase meaningful institutional reform made Lauren think about the 4-year patient review that was still ongoing, and the patients who'd received notification letters, and the ones who were now in the middle of understanding that something they'd been told about their care had not been accurate. That was the part that the ceremony didn't quite have room for, and she thought it needed to be held somewhere even if it couldn't be said aloud here, Paulette cried, which surprised her, and then didn't. Marcus the orderly shook her hand with both of his, which did not surprise her at all. Danny Keyes came. She stood at the back of the room and left before the small reception afterward, and Lauren saw her go and thought that was probably the right decision for both of them. The thing between them wasn't resolved exactly. It was acknowledged, which was different but still something. Derek, the new nurse with the notebook, asked her to sign it. She wrote her name and the date and nothing else, because she didn't know what wisdom was appropriate to inscribe in a graduate nurse's notebook and preferred not to guess. She called Westfield the following morning and accepted the position. The conversation was 11 minutes long and covered logistics, start date, reporting structure, remote work parameters, the first set of protocols she'd be reviewing. Westfield was the same as she'd been in person, direct, clear, with no interest in filling silence for its own sake. At the end, she said, "You're going to be useful here, Ms. Mercer." "Lauren," she said. It was the second time she'd made the correction with someone who outranked her, and it felt more natural than the first. "Lauren," Westfield said. "Yes, you are." After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table. Same chair, same window, the same fence post where the magpie had been sitting the morning after she was suspended, empty now. She looked at the field behind the yard where the winter had laid itself down with the particular flatness of Wyoming in January, the color of old paper, the sky above it a clean, hard white. She thought about the man in room 14 and the 4 minutes and the decision she'd made without hesitation. She thought about the laminated card in its clear sleeve, placed there 15 years before by a man who understood that his life might someday depend on someone paying attention to a small detail in a crowded chart. She thought about the 2 women who'd filed complaints before her, Nkosi and Pham, who'd told the truth into an institution that swallowed it, and how their truth had not disappeared, only waited, in filing systems and case numbers, for the moment when someone else's documentation gave it the traction it needed to move. That was something she hadn't expected to understand when she arrived in Danton 11 weeks into a provisional nursing job, how long truth could wait, how patient it was, how it accumulated in timestamps and medication logs and the testimony of people who wrote down what they saw even when no one seemed interested. She had not come to Mercy Bluff General Hospital to expose anyone or correct anything or be anyone's story about institutional accountability. She'd come because she needed quiet and distance and the ordinary dailiness of patients and charts and rounds. She'd come because she was trying to find the version of herself that existed outside of combat and outside of the Army and outside of the specific weight of everything she'd been doing for a decade. She had found something else instead, or it had found her. Something that turned out to be the same work she'd always done, just in a context that stripped away every protection and credential and institutional backing, until all that remained was the question itself. When there is something here that needs to be done, and you are the person who can see it, do you act? She had always known her answer. The table was quiet. The coffee was hot. Outside, the Wyoming winter sat on everything with its cold, impartial weight. Lauren Mercer picked up her pen, the one she kept in her jacket pocket out of old habit, the one she'd used to write a partial license plate on the back of her hand in a hospital parking lot, and opened the notebook where she'd been keeping her preliminary notes for the protocol review. She had work to do. Not because someone was watching, not because there was a reward at the end of it, not because the last 2 weeks had proven something she needed to keep proving, because the work was real and she was good at it, and the next person who needed a trauma protocol written correctly deserved someone who understood what correct actually meant in the field, not in a manual. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She underlined it, her habit always, so that the sequence was clear. Then she began. There is a particular kind of person the world underestimates because they are quiet, because they don't announce themselves, because they do the work without requiring the work to be witnessed. The world makes a mistake with people like this. It assumes that the absence of performance means the absence of capability. It assumes that the person who doesn't fight for the room's attention must not have anything worth saying. That assumption has costs. It had costs in every institution that let a Garrett run unchallenged because the nurses who saw what he was doing were provisional, were temporary, were easy to dismiss. It had costs in every chart that got altered, and every complaint that got managed, and every patient who was told a story about their own care that wasn't the truth. The correction doesn't come from an announcement. It comes from a timestamp at 9:17 a.m. It comes from a laminated card in a clear sleeve. It comes from the decision, made in 4 minutes or 40 years or the whole accumulated weight of a life, to do what the situation requires even when, especially when, no one is watching. Lauren had not saved a general because he was a general. She had saved a patient because he was in front of her, and his heart had stopped and she knew what to do. The rank had come later with everything else. The decision had come from something older and simpler, the refusal to look away from what was true. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. She wrote the first line of the protocol. Outside, a bird landed on the fence post, or returned to it, or was there for the first time. She didn't look up. She had her work, and it was enough, and it was hers, and she was not finished.